Next, from Springfield, we speak one-on-one with Congressman Aaron Schock, a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, the tax writing committee in Congress. We hear Representative Schock's views on the recent standoff over raising the federal debt ceiling, what he would do to balance the federal budget, and whether America should have a new trade agreement with Panama, Colombia, and South Korea. This runs about 35 minutes. Congressman Aaron Schock, thank you for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Good to be with you, Terry.
We obviously, as we sit here in the middle of August, we've had recently this huge national debate over the debt ceiling. Let's just go back to that moment for a moment. Were you in favor of the way that was handled to tie, as the Republicans did, tie cuts in spending to the debt ceiling?
I was. I think at the end of the day, the new majority in the House is laser focused on trying to bring down spending in Washington, D.C. It was a message that was sent in every congressional district across the country, which was get our financial house in order. This is a problem that has gone on for decades in Washington, D.C., but has reached really an exacerbated proportions right now. Under the last 8 years under the Bush administration, deficits ran anywhere from 200 to 400 billion. The last 2 years it's been 1.6 trillion and then 1.5 trillion respectively the first 2 years of the Obama administration. We've increased the debt limit 5 times in the last 2 years, from 9 trillion 2 years ago to 14 trillion today. That shows that we're spending money at an unsustainable rate. So to answer your question, we need to do everything we can to try and right the ship. Last thing I want to do is raise the debt limit under any circumstances, but this is really about making good on promises that the prior administrations and prior Congresses made in terms of spending that they accrued, and we couldn't allow our debt to default. We couldn't allow our government not to make good on its promises, but we also said, you know what? If we're going to increase the debt limit $2.5 trillion as the president requested, we're going to get $2.5 trillion in cuts. And I'm proud to say that for the first time in our country's history, for the first time in over 100 times of raising the debt limit in our country, this is the first time there have been requisite cuts as a part of a debt limit increase. And so I think the 2.5 cuts we got out of the last month of negotiations at the end of the day is a positive thing for our country.
The cuts that come are backloaded, so most of them would be in the out years.
Sure.
You know, some of the critics on the Republican side, on the more conservative, said that that's a sham, the cuts won't come, it'll be a different Congress. And they say, why not have the cuts up front?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great point. Look, I'd love to cut 1.6 trillion, which is our deficit this year today, if we could. The problem with the way government functions is so much of your expenses are entitlements, and nobody, not even the most conservative in Congress, wants to cut Social Security and Medicare to current recipients. So we're talking under the Republican proposal to change benefits for those 55 years of age or younger. In other words, those that are 10 years or more away from retirement, or those currently on retirement. What does that mean? It means you still have to deficit spend a little while until you bend the cost curve in the out years. Number one. Number two, we got as many cuts as we could in the initial year. We got $50 billion in cuts earlier this year when we passed the continuing resolution, which kept the government open and prevented a shutdown. And we got another roughly $20 billion in cuts as a part of the debt limit debate that will happen this year. This year ends September 30th. People forget the end of this fiscal year is September 30th. October 1st, there will be another battle when either the Senate has to pass the House versions of our budget, or we're going to have to get into these continuing resolution battles. That said, this will be the first year, as a result of the cuts we got earlier this year, the $50 billion, as well as the money that we got cut this year from the continuing resolution, or I'm sorry, the debt limit increase. This will be the first year since World War II that our federal government will actually spend less money than it did in the prior year. Why is that significant? Well, some of the same conservatives who's been critical of this proposal talk about Ronald Reagan and what a great fiscal conservative he was. The reality is, even under the Reagan administration, they could only slow the growth of government. They would battle Republicans and Democrats about, instead of a 5% increase in spending, it'd only be a 3%. increase in spending. But none of the years under the Reagan administration, even when he declared the era of big government is over, did they actually literally reduce the amount of money being spent from the prior year. This year, we will spend less money than we did last year, and that's the first time since the end of World War II.
And it bears repeating, just for people to follow these budget negotiations, that the majority of the federal budget at this point is not discretionary, and by that, discretionary spending is where the Congress would decide each year how much they're going to allocate on education or transportation.
Correct.
You're on the Ways and Means Committee now, which is the tax writing bill or spending committee, primary, I would say, spending committee of Congress. A very powerful committee, probably the most powerful, at least in the House, if not the entire Congress.
I'd argue it's the best committee.
Explain to the people, why is it so impossible for the United States to balance its budget year after year?
Well, a couple things. First of all, the way we spend money is there's built-in structural increases in all the budget line items. So what you do in your home or your business is what they call zero-based budgeting, where you basically start out with your pot of money and you say, how much are we going to spend on clothing, how much are we going to spend on food and the like. If the federal government, they start the new year with the base assumption that we're going to spend what we spent last year and then build in a certain amount of increase. That's backwards thinking based on most people's expectation. Number two, the lion's share of our spending is obligated already through entitlements. 65 cents out of every dollar we spend right now goes to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. Well, why is that relevant? Because you cut the heck out of transportation, education, social service, agriculture, and that's about $600 billion out of the $3.5 trillion that we spend. That $600 billion is equal to what we spend in defense, which is just over $600 billion as well. So even if you disbanded the military and you cut the entire rest of the government, you would still have to spend 65 cents out of the dollar just to fund those entitlement programs and interest on the debt. Well, why is that relevant? Because out of the dollar that we spend, 40 cents is borrowed. So we only have 60 cents out of our dollar that is truly our tax dollars. The other 40 cents we're borrowing largely from other countries. Well, if we only have 60 cents that's ours, and we need 65 cents to pay entitlements, it means that we don't even have enough revenue today to truly pay for our entitlement obligations that we've got. So if you don't change entitlements, if you don't go after fundamentally fixing Social Security and Medicare so it's around for the next generation of Americans, you can't really get the budget under control and bend the cost curve in the out years so that the budget balances.
Now, the Democrats would say that's proof positive that you need to raise taxes.
Well, what I would say to that is two things. Number one, from a political standpoint, they themselves prove that to be impossible. When the president was elected 2 years ago, he campaigned on raising taxes on people who make over $250,000. But despite that, he won with 60 seats in the Senate, which was a supermajority of Democrats. He won his re-election, or he won his election for president with an 80-seat majority in the House, one of the highest in our country's history. So with this party controlling both the House and the Senate, 60 votes in the Senate, 80-seat plus majority in the House, he couldn't get his own membership to vote to raise taxes on people that make, on households over $250,000. Well, why is that? Because over half of those people who file statements over $250,000, over half of them are small business people, people who employ 100 individuals or less. Those are the real job creators in this country. It's not the big Fortune 50 companies that are going to lead us out of this recovery or lead us into a recovery. It's the small business entrepreneurs that employ 7 people, 10 people, 50 people that do most of the hiring. 7 out of the 10 new jobs created this year were by people who employ less than 100 people. So the very people that the president's talking about raising taxes on are the very people that we need to be hiring, and we need to have them have the money to do so. That's the political answer as to why it can't happen. The practical answer as to why raising taxes is not the solution is that we got a $1.6 trillion deficit. We could tax households that make over 250,000 or anybody that files over 250,000, we could tax all their income over 250,000 at 100%. So all the money Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and anybody here in the Springfield community makes over 250, we take all 100% of it and it wouldn't generate 1.6 trillion in revenue. So the idea that somehow if the rich among us would just pay a little bit more, if the millionaires and billionaires would just, quote, pay their fair share, somehow we can solve this is really devoid of fact. The reality is we're going to have to grow our way out, and we're going to have to just simply reduce the size of government and the spending in Washington, D.C.
If we're going to cut the federal government, I presume that's the only way you can do it. We talk about where would you pick to cut?
Well, as I mentioned, the third rail of politics that nobody wants to talk about are entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I do not favor changing benefits for anybody that's on or near retirement. But if we do this responsibly now, we can save the system for the next generation of Americans, my generation of Americans, and generations of Americans yet to come. We can save those programs if we make those decisions today, and it's not necessary to cut current beneficiaries. For example, with Social Security, if you tell people under the age of 55 that they're going to have to work an additional 1 month for every year that they are younger than the age of 55, Social Security becomes solvent. So if you're 50 years of age today, you'd have to work 5 more months. So instead of retiring at 67, you could get your Social Security 100% benefits at 67 in 5 months. I think those are realistic changes that make the program solvent, that instill confidence in most Americans to say, you know what, I'm willing to work a few months longer if I know the guarantee is going to be there, if I know Social Security will be solvent, and equally important, I know my taxes aren't going to go up. Let's make those changes now to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid to make those programs solvent. Beyond that, you need to look for all the waste in government. There's a lot of duplicative programs. For example, when we're building highways, we require people to get a sign-off by the Illinois EPA and the US EPA. There's the US Department of Transportation, the state departments of transportation that have a lot of duplicative. Education, my years on the school board would tell you, the amount of money the federal government gives to local school districts is next to nothing. It's less than 5% of funding for local school districts comes from the federal government, yet most of the mandates to local school districts come from the federal government. So, that is an area where I think we can cut. So there's a lot of areas within the bureaucracy that we can cut, and I would say, Terry, it's not even so much about the dollars you save by cutting those bureaucrats, it's actually the efficiencies you create back home. School districts not having to mess with the red tape, construction people wanting to build highways not being slowed down by the federal government, and the private sector who's wanting to expand in oil and natural gas and building nuclear plants. It would be easier to do so if there was less regulation and burden by the federal government.
Let me ask, when we talk about $600 billion for defense, of course, many times when we get into these discussions, the Republicans want to attack domestic programs, various ones. The Democrats often say, let's cut from defense. Barney Frank the other day said we could cut $250 billion out of defense. What's your take on defense? In fact, I remember Newt Gingrich once said, I'm a hawk, but I'm a cheap hawk. Is there money that could be cut out of defense?
Without question. No department in the federal government spends all of its money perfectly. And for anyone to suggest that somehow the Department of Defense is a sacred cow, or does not have inefficiencies, or spends all $600 billion of it wisely, is devoid of reality. Now, having said that, there are a few things that our Constitution says are the role of the federal government. There are a few things that state governments and local governments and us as private citizens can't do for ourselves. And one of those is in our Constitution says, number one, the United States government shall provide common defense of its people. That's the U.S. military. And I think we can't lose sight of that basic fundamental responsibility of the federal government. It used to be that the lion's share of our money was spent on providing that common defense. As I mentioned earlier,
under President Kennedy, I'll interject, half the federal budget went to defense.
Correct. And that wasn't too long ago. I mean, we're talking 1960s.
Right.
Half of it went to defense. Today, of $3.5 trillion, only $600 billion. So we're talking roughly 20% going to defense. If we're only spending $600 billion to fund our military, as Mr. Barney Franks would recommend cutting $250 billion, I think that's a bit severe. At the end of the day, we need to be able to protect ourselves and our allies around the world and fight for democracy and preservation of freedom. And we need to make sure that the cuts don't jeopardize our ability to respond to threats, foreign and domestic. And I think that needs to remain our focus. But when it comes to Secretary Gates coming forward with $16 billion this year in waste in contracts and purchase orders that weren't necessary, I supported the elimination of that and will continue to press the department agencies to find the waste in their respective.
We talk about tax not increasing. We've already talked about not increasing the taxes. But one of the other things people are saying about tax reform, that the system is so screwed up that nobody likes it.
Yep.
Would you favor reform, and do you have any reforms in mind? You're obviously, again, on Ways and Means, you're on the key committee.
Great question, Terry. You make a great point. And look, our tax code now is 10,000 pages long. Even most CPAs and tax attorneys are confused by it, let alone an individual taxpayer who tries to file their own taxes. We can make the tax code simpler and fair for every American. For example, 48% of Americans right now pay no income tax. So 48% of Americans are able to get off free primarily through different deductions that they take credit for that allows them to end up paying no net taxes to the federal government. Now, I'm not willing to lay a marker in the sand and say this is the minimum rate, but I think most people would accept the fact that every American should pay something for the joy and the benefit of being an American and driving on our roads and getting a free public education and having law enforcement and fire departments down the street. They should pay something. So we can broaden the base by making everybody pay something and get rid of all of these carve-outs or deductions and then lower the top rate. So what we're looking at right now for it to be revenue neutral is if you get rid of all of the deductions, you can bring the top rate from 35% down to 25% and bring those people who make somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000, their rate would be 10%. So you wouldn't be deducting the per child tax credit, you wouldn't get the marriage tax credit, there wouldn't be a marriage penalty either though, but there wouldn't be picking winners and losers within the energy sector. There wouldn't be wind energy tax credit or ethanol tax credit or biodiesel tax credit or oil production tax credits. There wouldn't be sugar subsidies or cotton subsidies. All of these different industries that have very organized lobbies out in Washington, D.C., we'd get rid of that and say, you know what, you should be able to file your tax return on a postcard and say, if I made 50 grand this year at 10%, I owe 5,000 and be done.
Is that realistic? Do you think there's... Let's talk a little bit about the mood on Capitol Hill. We often hear how poisonous it is. Given how it is on Capitol Hill, and I don't want to characterize it, I'll let you do that, but are we at a point where we're reaching critical mass where people are saying, okay, it's really time to pony up and get something done. We've been talking about reforms for years. Mm-hmm. The budget continues to spiral out of control. Or, and that seems, by the way, I would advise the mood of the American people. Or is Congress the odd man out and so polarized that it's increasingly unlikely to get anything done?
Well, the debates that took place the last couple of weeks over the debt limit obviously highlight the great divide, the radically different worldviews that a conservative House have in contrast with the more liberal president. That said, things like tax reform, there is broad bipartisan support for, because regardless of your ideology, whether you're a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican, you look at the tax code and say, you know, why should Bob Smith in America pay a higher tax rate so that we can incentivize someone else to buy a windmill? Or why should Susie Smith in America pay a higher tax rate so that someone else can get a production tax credit out in the oil fields? Why should anybody in America pay a higher tax rate so that somebody else gets an offsetting benefit? Why are we picking winners and losers in our tax code? Why don't we just say, look, we need to collect X amount of dollars to fund the federal government to provide these basic services, and then we'll let the free market decide whether you want to invest in clean coal, nuclear, wind, solar, and the like. The same thing with real estate. Why do we favor investments in real estate as opposed to stocks and bonds? So,
would you favor getting rid of the home mortgage deduction?
You know, that is not on my agenda because I have more residents in my district who own real estate and own their homes. But Terry, what was interesting to me is when Charlie Rangel, who's been a longstanding member of the Ways and Means Committee, former chairman, said, by God, we need to get rid of the mortgage deduction. And of course, my eyes opened up being a new member of the committee, and I said, Charlie, why would you say that? He said, listen, I'm from New York City. Do you think my constituents own their buildings? They all rent. And the mortgage deduction favors the property owner, the landowner. And so his point is, the line of my constituents pay a higher income tax and they never see the benefit of the mortgage deduction. So I'm not supportive of that. What I'm suggesting is all of the cows are on the table. There's no sacred cow right now. And whatever the deal is that gets Republicans and Democrats to come together will be an overall simplification of the deal. There'll probably be some deductions. Maybe mortgage deduction will be added back. The other one I think will be tough to get rid of would be the charitable deduction, because most people think you should get a deduction for donating to charity. Those are the two most popular, but ironically the two most expensive deductions that the federal government allows for.
Let's jump around here, or jump to a different topic. One of the things that's pending right now, well, Doug Oberhelman, CEO of Caterpillar, which is major Illinois corporation, major U.S. corporation, and in your district, mentioned in an interview the other day, I think that they had just recently hired, I believe it was 1,000 people, I might have the number wrong. He said all of those new jobs are tied to foreign trade. Governor Quinn has proposed over the next 4 years to try to double Illinois' exports. One of the issues that's pending right now up on the Hill is a new trade agreement with Panama, South Korea, and Colombia. Are you in favor of that, and where does that stand?
Terry, I'm absolutely in favor of those three trade agreements. It makes complete sense that the most successful country in the world would want to build and produce goods for the rest of the world. We're only 5% of the world's population. It takes a pretty defeatist mentality for anyone to suggest that America would be better off only building and selling to America. It only makes sense that our 5% would want to sell to the other 95% of the world. So that said, trade agreements, when we create a level playing field, have always benefited America. In fact, every major company that we have, or every country that we have a trade agreement with, we have significant trade surplus. So it makes sense for America's manufacturers and agricultural organizations for us to have these trade agreements. Ag, as you know, is the #1 employer in my district. #2 is manufacturing. Caterpillar, it's huge. So Colombia, Panama, and South Korea trade agreements would offer guaranteed market access for our farmers and our manufacturers. It would create, by the president's estimates, President Obama, over 200,000 jobs in the first 6 months of those bills being passed, and it doesn't cost us any money. These are no-cost job bills. You know, there's all this talk about we need job bills and how much we got to spend to create jobs. This doesn't cost us any money to enter in these trade agreements, and by the president's own estimation, we're talking several 100,000 jobs as a result.
What do you say to some workers out there who go, here's another congressman sending our jobs overseas?
Well, it's a fair question. The reality is the facts don't bear that out. Did we lose some factories to China, to Mexico and the like? Sure. We don't have a free trade agreement with China. We don't have a free trade agreement with Saudi Arabia. Those are countries where we're losing our shorts, quite frankly, in terms of the trade balance. But when we do a trade agreement with a country and we create a level playing field, America can compete with the best of them. The other thing I would say is these countries are perfect marriages for us because they don't produce competing products. For example, in Colombia, their major products are things like coffee and flowers, things that we're already producing or we're already buying as an American population. What do they want from us? They want America's wheat and corn. They want America's Caterpillar tractors and John Deere tractors. They don't make those in their country. So it's a great marriage in terms of we're not even competing with their sectors, and their sectors really aren't competing with ours.
Does it look like passage, or is it going to be still held up?
As long as the president has to send the language to us after Labor Day. He announced before it broke at the end of July that he was going to do that. So if he sends the bills to the Congress in September, when we come back, they'll pass. They'll pass because there are enough Republicans and Democrats who both agree this is a smart thing for America's economy and for the growth of our country. And all the trade bills that have passed in past Congresses have been done so in a bipartisan way, and I'd expect these three to do the same.
Time's running short. There's a lot of other issues we could talk about, but let's wrap up with this. We're about 5 to 6 months away from the Iowa caucus. We're going to go into the election cycle. President Obama's ratings in the polls are at historic lows. And yet, there's many Republicans who say they just don't like those people who are in the field right now. I had one person recently say, I'm a lifelong Republican. Everyone I want to have run is not running. Jeb Bush, Mitch Daniels, Chris Christie. Do you have a pick, and what do you make of the current Republican field?
Well, I have not made a pick. What I've told the candidates is, I'm a Republican, I believe in the free market, and I want you to compete. And so I think what we're seeing over the course of the last couple of weeks, and we'll see over the next several months, is that competition whittle down and the strongest members will emerge. We saw a few weeks ago Tim Pawlenty drop out as a result of part of that competition. As a result of that competition, we saw Governor Perry from Texas get into the competition. I think we're going to see more entrants and exits over the next couple of months. Being from Illinois, our election isn't until March, so it gives me plenty of time after the Christmas and New Year's holiday to make a decision on who I'm going to support, and then try and rally my base and voters in the primary behind that guy or gal that I think would be most capable to serve. But I do think the media, though, Terry, has really downplayed the quality of the candidates, and I would say, actually, I think many of these folks who are running would do a much better job than the current occupant of the White House, and I'd be pretty comfortable at the end of the day supporting any of them if they became the nominee.
I know you got to run, but I'm curious. How well do you know the president? You were both at one point in the legislature. I don't remember if you served together with him.
You know, I ran and was elected to the State House when he ran and was elected to the U.S. Senate. And then when he ran and was elected to the presidency, I was running and elected to Congress. So we have, when I was in the State House, he was my U.S. Senator, and so we worked together in that capacity. You know, a few weeks after he was sworn in as president, he was kind enough to invite me on Air Force One back to Peoria the day before the stimulus vote, where he went to Caterpillar to promote the stimulus bill. I ultimately didn't vote for the stimulus bill, which I don't think he was too pleased with. But our relationship, I think, would be described as cordial. We have mutual respect for one another. You're not going to hear me call him mean and nasty names. But we fundamentally disagree on the direction of our country in terms of policies to promote growth.
I just wondered, everyone who has met the president, and I've had the pleasure of meeting him when he was here, he's one of the nicest people, most personable people you'd ever meet. He's the kind of guy, it seems to me, it's almost like your instant best friend.
Sure.
And yet I think people are at a quandary. It's like what to make of this guy on both sides of the aisle. He's obviously bright, and yet some people say he doesn't have the leadership skills. What is your read on Obama as the president?
Well, I think he has failed to lead in an effective way. At the end of the day, it's one thing to talk about what you want to do. It's another thing to have actually delivered on what you want to do. It's the difference between being a part of a team and being the leader of the team. And he did a great job of laying out a vision for what he wants to do with the country, but he can't blame George W. Bush. He can't blame the Republicans in Congress for being the obstructionists that prohibited him from being successful. I mean, let's not forget, for the first years of his administration, he had a supermajority in the Senate. He had an 80-seat majority in the House. The economy we have right now is his economy. The condition we have in our country is a condition created by his policies. And that's just a reality. This isn't something that happened 6 months ago. We're 2.5 years into this president's administration. He is a good guy. He's a nice guy. I think he means well. He wants this country to be successful. From my view, his policies are not ones that allow our country to be as successful as it should be. And so at the end of the day, the voters will, that referendum on whether he's done a good job will ultimately happen next November when he faces re-election. And the voters will get to decide, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Does he warrant another 4 years, or is it time to give somebody else another try? And my belief is when that time comes, if unemployment continues to be above 9%, if there's still a failure of leadership to deal with entitlement reform. Let me give you a real case in point example. The Republicans came forward with our budget this year that dealt with entitlement reform, that dealt with curbing the deficit spending. That budget passed with more votes in the House than any budget passed the House in 10 years. You got Republicans and Democrats to support that budget. It was drafted by our chairman, Paul Ryan, of the Budget Committee. When that bill passed, the president, I think, had a perfect opportunity to lead. He could have come out with his own budget that was a little more to the center, not quite as far to the right as our budget, and said, you know what, I think those Republicans have gone too far. I'm going to come out with one a little more moderate. And he could have gotten Republicans and Democrats to come on board. But instead, he demagogued what the Republicans did in terms of a thoughtful proposal to deal with the spiraling debt, and instead just lambasted us for, quote, trying to kick grandma off Medicare, which is not true. My point is, we still haven't solved the problem. My point is, rather than being a leader and putting out his own plan, his own ideas, arguing that his plan and his ideas are better, he really was stuck in campaign mode and just beat us up for our plan and sticking our necks out there with ideas. And so as a result, here's the country without a budget. Here's the country without a plan to deal with its debt. And that's why S&P downgraded us. That's why our economy is in stagnation and there isn't the kind of growth, optimism, and confidence in our country right now.
Congressman Aaron Schock, it's always interesting. We kept you already longer than we should have, so we appreciate that. Thanks again for being with
Terry.
us.
Good to be with you.
Good luck in the fall and next year.
Thank you.
Take care.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.